Now that Angela Merkel has finally left the political stage, many commentators have begun looking back at her legacy, whether she's left Germany in a better or worse position, and just how well she's fared over her 16 years at the helm of Europe's largest economy. While there's been an immense amount of debate as to what her most successful policy is, there's a consensus gathering around her worst, Nord Stream 2. In this video, we're going to take a look at just why Nord Stream 2 is so controversial, especially now, and why it might end up being Merkel's biggest mistake. Before we start, a huge thank you to everyone who supported TLDR in 2021. Across our channels, we've picked up a ton of new viewers, so if you want more in 2022, then subscribe to all of the TLDR channels for updates. Before we get into the nitty gritty, it's probably best to quickly recap exactly what Nord Stream 2 is. At its core, Nord Stream 2 is relatively simple. It's an expansion of the current natural gas pipelines connecting Russia and Germany that flow under the Baltic Sea. Supplementing Nord Stream 1's original annual capacity for up to 55 billion cubic meters of natural gas, Nord Stream 2 would double the number of lines on the route from 2 to 4. But while the physical aspects of the projects are relatively simple, the politics are anything but. There are three main and somewhat interlinked areas of concern related to the project: Russia, relationships, and the response to climate change. When it comes to Russia, the concerns can actually be broken down a little further, into an increased reliance on it for gas and the thorny issue of Ukraine. Europe is already incredibly reliant on Russia for its energy demands. During the first semester of 2021, 46.8% of all extra EU imports of natural gas came from Russia. With regards to petroleum oil, that figure is 24.7%. With Germany set to phase out nuclear power entirely by 2022, it's had to find other sources to meet its energy demands, one of which is natural gas. Natural gas delivered through, you guessed it, the Nord Stream pipeline. As anyone who studied economics will know, if there's a limited number of suppliers and demand for a good increases, then you hand a lot of market power to those suppliers, i.e., you hand a lot of market power to Russia. Market power that can transform into geopolitical power by linking natural gas deliveries to political objectives, which is where Ukraine begins to come into play. Over the past few weeks and months, Russia has been deploying far more aggressive rhetoric with regards to Ukraine. Having annexed Crimea back in 2014, many fear that it's planning to further its control over Ukrainian territory by mounting an offensive. While many European allies of Ukraine have warned Russia over the grave consequences that would ensue if it did invade Ukraine, Europe's reliance on gas gives Russia its own leverage over Europe. If Europe retaliates, Russia can cut off their gas supply and send them back to the Stone Ages. Obviously, Nord Stream 2 would further increase European reliance on Russian gas, gifting Putin even more geopolitical leverage. But Russia's use of gas pipelines for its interests regarding Ukraine isn't anything new. Back in 2011, when the first line of the original Nord Stream pipeline came online, Vladimir Putin, then Russia's Prime Minister, warned Ukraine that Russia would now have the upper hand when it came to negotiations over gas price disputes. The reason being that up until the completion of the original Nord Stream pipeline, natural gas from Russia tended to flow to Western Europe through Ukraine and Poland. And in order to have a huge pipeline crossing through someone else's country, you're going to have to stump up some cash in the form of a transit fee. I.e., in order for Russia to sell gas to Germany, it would have to pay Ukraine and Poland to have the gas pumped through their borders. With an alternative route now available to Russia, both Ukraine and Poland no longer held a monopoly on supply routes. This is something that Putin is clearly conscious of. In September, he noted that like any transit country, Ukraine has the temptation to benefit from its position. Now this exclusive right disappears, our relations will become more civilized. Beyond politics, there's also the issue of money. Ukraine currently earns about $2 billion a year from transit fees, making gas transit fees a substantial part of Ukraine's budget. If Russia starts diverting more and more gas through alternative pipelines, the amount of money Ukraine gets as transit fees will inevitably shrink. It's worth noting that for now, Russia has actually committed to continuing funneling gas through Ukraine, but this is obviously a commitment that needs to be taken with a pinch of salt. On the broader relationship front, the pipeline has been an area of tension between Germany, under Merkel it was a vigorous supporter, and both the rest of the EU and the US, who object to the plan, for the reasons we've mentioned earlier, notably Russia. For both the US and EU, Nord Stream increases the wider reliance on Russia for energy, and thus puts them in a bind when it comes to political issues such as Ukraine. 4 different American administrations have expressed concern over the pipeline, from George W. Bush over the original Nord Stream pipeline through Barack Obama, Donald Trump, and now Joe Biden. The US originally attempted to stifle the project by imposing significant sanctions against firms involved with it, but these were relatively unsuccessful, and Biden eventually abandoned the sanctions once it became apparent that it was counterproductive to the transatlantic relationship. On the climate front, though, some question whether Germany made the right decision back in 2011 to phase out nuclear power. According to a report by BP, Germany is, outside of China and the US, the world's largest consumer of coal, accounting for 1.2% of global consumption. For some context, in 2020, Germany accounted for nearly a third of the EU's entire consumption of coal, using more than the entirety of South and Central America combined. This all raises the question, how do you meet energy demand sustainably at the same time you're actively closing down nuclear power plants and plan to do the same with coal? And is a natural gas pipeline really the best option? Which brings us to the current day. Germany obviously now has a new government. Olaf Scholz, Germany's new chancellor, was, at his first EU summit, urged by other EU leaders to use the possible cancellation of Nord Stream 2 as part of a threat to deter Russia's invasion of Ukraine. Just last week, Germany's foreign minister, Annalena Baerbock, announced that the pipeline could not be approved and turned on as it didn't meet the requirements of EU energy law, causing European natural gas futures to surge 10%. Germany's energy regulator also last week announced that there would be no decisions in the first half of 2022 when it came to the certification of the pipeline. Tensions on the matter are turned up to 11 when you consider the fact that Europe is continuing to face an energy crisis. European gas prices have continued to climb since Baerbock's announcement, reaching a new high of just over €148 per megawatt hour at the beginning of this week, with that price climbing yet higher to €183 per megawatt hour by Tuesday. The price has been driven up partly by Russia. Flows through the Yamal-Europe pipeline, one of the 3 pipelines connecting Europe and Russia, dropped to just 6% of capacity on Saturday and 5% on Sunday, leading many people to connect the dots and see the decline of gas flows as a deliberate strategy to force the approval of Nord Stream 2. So, with tensions rising to new heights, environmental concerns, and Russia seemingly throwing its weight around, it's not hard to see why some are already starting to criticise this new German strategy, and why, just days after leaving office, some are calling this Merkel's biggest mistake. But what do you think? Are fears over Nord Stream 2 overplayed? Is Germany right to phase out nuclear power? And will Nord Stream 2 go down as Merkel's biggest error? As always, let us know your thoughts in the comments below. Also, be sure to subscribe to the channel and all of the other TLDR channels to get updates on stories like this as we head into 2022. A special thanks to our Patreon backers who make videos like this one possible. And if you want to see your name at the end of videos, then you too can back us on Patreon. The link to that is in the description.